Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly dangerous. Getting dressed. Not skydiving, not bear wrestling, not eating gas station sushi at a truck stop. Just putting on clothes in Tudor England, where the wrong colour of stocking could land you in front of a magistrate. That's right. Tonight we're exploring the strange, paranoid, fabulously petty world of Tudor dress laws, a time when the government cared deeply, passionately and legally about whether your neighbour was allowed to own a velvet hat. Before you get comfortable, I want to say a sincere thank you to whoever dropped this topic into the comments. These suggestions genuinely shape what we make here, and I'd be lost without them. So take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And if you'd rather drift off with your eyes closed, we're now on Spotify too, so you can find the channel there using the link in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and try not to think too hard about your tax bracket. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to live somewhere your outfit was a legal document? Could you go to jail for wearing the wrong shade of purple? Was there really a law about what hat you wore to church on Sunday? Could a stranger demand to see proof of your income just because your shirt looked a little too nice? And would you survive a single morning of getting dressed without committing roughly 4 felonies before breakfast? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1574. You have a closet full of clothes, a head full of ambition, and absolutely no legal right to wear most of what you own. Good luck. So here you are, blinking awake in Tudor England, and before you've even found your other shoe, you've broken the law. Not by doing anything, just by existing near fabric you can't afford the legal right to wear. Welcome to the world of the statutes of apparel, a sprawling rulebook that decided exactly what every single person in the kingdom was allowed to put on their body, right down to the trim on your sleeves. This wasn't fashion advice, it was legislation. Parliament and the Crown sat down on purpose and wrote actual laws about velvet. And you, my friend, are about to spend your entire day tiptoeing through a minefield made entirely of cloth. Let's get a sense of just how thorough this was. These weren't vague suggestions scribbled on a tavern wall. They were detailed, layered statutes and royal proclamations, reissued again and again across the century because people kept ignoring them. Henry VIII alone fired off 5 separate proclamations on what his subjects could wear. His daughter Elizabeth, never one to be outdone, managed 12. 12. That is 12 official government announcements about the deeply pressing national crisis of people wearing nicer shirts than they were entitled to, and the rules reached everywhere. They didn't just cover the obvious luxuries like crowns and royal robes. They reached into the closets of dukes, knights, gentlemen, merchants, farmers and servants, assigning each rank its own permitted fabrics, colours, furs and decorations like a vast, joyless seating chart. There was a correct outfit for an earl and a correct outfit for a yeoman, and the gap between them was patrolled with the seriousness most societies reserve for, say, weapons or taxes. Picture your morning. You reach for a shirt and a little voice in the back of your head, the voice of a society that has fully lost the plot, asks, but are you legally permitted to enjoy that texture? You consider a splash of colour and immediately have to run a quick mental audit of your annual income. You think about a bit of fur to keep warm, and you realise you must first determine which animals your social rank is allowed to wear. Getting dressed has become a compliance exercise. You're not picking an outfit. You're filing paperwork with your body. The truly maddening part is that the clothes themselves were not the point. The fabric didn't care who wore it. A length of silk is just a length of silk. It does not check your bank balance before it touches your skin. No, the point was control. The point was that the people in charge were deeply, profoundly anxious about a world in which you couldn't tell a person's worth just by squinting at them across the street. So they tried to solve a social problem with a wardrobe. And here's the thing you'll learn very quickly today. nearly everything you might actually want to wear is spoken for. The good colours, the soft fabrics, the warm furs, the shiny bits, claimed, ranked, and locked behind a wall of statute. What's left for you is a narrow little menu of approved, sensible, unmistakably middling cloth, designed to make sure no one ever mistakes you for someone important. So take a breath, stand in your cold one-room home, and accept your situation. You live in a kingdom where your outfit is evidence, your neighbours are witnesses, and your tailor is essentially an unlicensed accomplice. Before you can get dressed, you really ought to understand why anyone thought this was a good idea. So let's talk about the grand, paranoid logic behind it all. Let's talk about why any of this existed, because at first it sounds completely unhinged. The whole point was something the Tudors were obsessed with: legibility. They wanted to look at a stranger across a muddy street and instantly know their exact rank, like scanning a barcode made of fabric. Your clothes weren't supposed to express you. They were supposed to file you. A duke looked like a duke. A yeoman looked like a yeoman. And heaven help the man who looked richer than he was legally permitted to be. In a society terrified of people climbing above their station, your outfit was basically a name tag that said, "Hello, my social standing is," and lying on it was a crime. To understand the panic, you have to understand the world it lived in. Tudor society imagined itself as a tidy ladder with God at the top, then the monarch, then the nobility, the gentry, and on down to the labourers in the mud. Everyone had a rung, and the comforting fiction was that everyone stayed on it. Your clothes were how that ladder was made visible. They were the public proof that the system was working, that everyone knew their place and was politely standing in it. Now imagine the horror then of meeting a man on the road in a fine silk doublet and a dashing fur, and not knowing whether to bow or to ignore him. Is he a lord? A wealthy merchant pretending to be a lord? A con artist in a borrowed cloak? In a world without photographs, without identification, without any way to look someone up, your clothing did the work that an entire bureaucracy does today. You were your outfit. And if your outfit lied, the whole comforting machine of knowing your place began to grind. That's the real fear humming underneath every one of these laws. It wasn't really about taste, and it certainly wasn't about helping anyone dress nicely. It was about keeping the categories clean. The nobility wanted to be instantly recognisable as nobility, and they wanted the people below them to be just as instantly recognisable as below them. Clothing was a fence, and the laws were there to stop you climbing over it in a nice jacket. Think about how exhausting this makes ordinary life. Today you can glance at a stranger and you simply don't know if they're rich, broke, or somewhere in between, and crucially, you don't have to care. In Tudor England, you were expected to read every person you passed like a receipt, fabric by fabric, trim by trim, calculating their precise rank so you'd know exactly how much grovelling was appropriate. Too little deference to a noble, awkward. Too much deference to a faker, humiliating. Your eyes were constantly doing math. And this is why the system was so brittle, and why it generated law after law after law. The moment a fabric became a status symbol, people wanted it, and the moment people wanted it, some of them got it however they could. Every silk shirt on the wrong back was a tiny crack in the wall. So the crown kept patching, kept proclaiming, kept tightening, in a doomed campaign to freeze the social order in place by freezing the wardrobe. You, standing here at dawn, are a small soldier in that campaign whether you like it or not. Your dull, approved clothing is doing its job, announcing loudly and legally that you're exactly who you appear to be and nothing more. Which brings us to the colours you're absolutely, positively forbidden to touch, starting with the most dangerous shade in the entire kingdom. It's time to talk about purple, the single most dangerous colour in your entire wardrobe. In Tudor England, purple silk was reserved almost exclusively for the monarch and a sliver of the royal family. Not frowned upon, not a bit gauche, legally off limits. The dye was rare, wildly expensive and soaked in centuries of imperial symbolism, so the crown simply claimed it like a toddler claiming the last cookie. So if you woke up this morning feeling like a nice plum tunic, congratulations, you've just dressed yourself in treason-adjacent outerwear. Pick literally any other colour. There are dozens. Purple, however, belongs to one specific lady in a very large palace, and she did not ask for your opinion. To appreciate why purple got this treatment, you have to understand that this colour came with baggage older than the kingdom itself. For well over 1,000 years, deep purple had been the colour of emperors, the shade so costly and so prized that wearing it was practically a way of saying, "I rule things." The Tudors inherited all that symbolism and were delighted to keep it. Purple meant sovereignty. It meant the very top of the very top, and the very top was not interested in sharing. So the proclamation spelled it out with charming bluntness. The silk of purple colour belonged to the king and the queen and their nearest blood. A duke or a marquis might begrudgingly permitted a whisper of it in something ceremonial, like the robes of a high order, but that was the edge of the world. Everyone beyond it was in forbidden territory. The colour didn't just signal royalty, it was, legally speaking, a royal possession that happened to come in fabric form. Now, picture the absurdity from your end. Purple is, in the grand scheme of things, just a colour. It's the colour of plums, of bruises, of certain unfortunate sunsets. It does nothing. It harms no one. And yet here, draping it across your shoulders could see you treated as if you'd reached up and tried on the crown itself. You haven't claimed any lands. You haven't raised an army. You've simply enjoyed a hue, and somehow that's a problem for the state. It's a bit like living in a world where one specific shade exists behind glass with an alarm on it, and everyone has silently agreed that touching it is unthinkable. You can admire it, you can dream of it, but the moment you wear it out in public, you've effectively cosplayed as the monarch without a permit, and people will notice. Heads will turn, whispers will start. Somewhere, an official will reach for a very official pen. And this is your first hard lesson of the morning. In Tudor England, colour is not neutral. Colour is rank. Some shades are humble and yours to enjoy, and some shades are loaded weapons you are not licensed to carry. Purple sits right at the dangerous end, glowing with a meaning you are absolutely forbidden to borrow. It's not a fashion choice. It's a statement of identity, and the only person allowed to make that particular statement is sitting on a throne. So you regretfully set the dream of a fine purple tunic aside where it belongs, somewhere far above your station and slightly out of reach of the law. Surely you think, there must be something gorgeous still left to you, something that shimmers. Your eye drifts hopefully toward anything that catches the morning light, which is exactly the wrong instinct, because the shiniest things in this kingdom are spoken for too. Now that purple is off the table, let your eye drift towards something shimmering, cloth of gold and silver tissue, fabric literally woven through with precious metal. It glitters, it dazzles, it costs more per yard than your house, and it too is essentially royal property. By proclamation, this stuff was locked down to the king, the queen, and a tiny handful of the very top nobility, who were graciously permitted a little gold in their doublets and not one thread more. The message was simple. The monarch gets to twinkle, and you get to admire from a respectful distance. So no, you cannot drape yourself in shimmering gold and call it confidence. You can call it a court date. Let's actually picture this fabric, because it's hard to overstate how outrageous it was. Cloth of gold was real cloth shot through with real metal thread, Thin strips of gilded or silvered material wound around silk and woven into the weave. It caught candlelight and threw it back at you. It made the wearer look less like a person and more like a small walking sunrise. In a dim world lit by fire and tallow, someone in cloth of gold didn't just enter a room. They illuminated it. That was the entire point. And that effect was far too powerful to leave lying around for anyone to use. The proclamations carved it up with the precision of a will. The plain purple silk and the cloth of gold tissue were for the monarch, full stop. Then, descending one careful step, dukes and marquises were allowed a strictly limited amount of cloth of gold in certain garments, doublets, sleeveless coats, and even then capped at a value per yard so they couldn't get carried away. Everyone below that rarefied handful got nothing. No gold, no silver tissue, not a shimmer. So consider your odds. You're not a duke. You're not a marquis. You are, on a good day, a respectable nobody with mud on your shoes. The gleaming fabric you're admiring is so far above your legal reach that wanting it is almost funny. It's like a peasant gazing longingly at the moon and wondering if he might just slip it on over his tunic. The answer, in case there's any doubt, is no. And also, how dare you? Here's the genuinely clever, slightly infuriating logic of it. By hoarding the sparkle, the crown made the sparkle mean something. If everyone could wear gold, gold would mean nothing, just another shiny thing in a crowd of shiny things. But if only the monarch glows, then the glow itself becomes a kind of power. The dazzle says, I am the one you cannot imitate. Every yard of forbidden gold on the royal body is a yard of gold pointedly absent from yours. The contrast is the message. And you feel that contrast keenly this morning, standing in your sensible wool, watching the light fail to do anything interesting to your clothes whatsoever. You do not gleam. You were never meant to gleam. Gleaming is a privilege of rank, dispensed from the top, and denied to nearly everyone. And you are firmly in the everyone category. Your job is to be the dull, matte background against which your betters shine. So you let the fantasy of cloth of gold go gently, the way you let purple go a moment ago, into the pile of beautiful things that belong to other people by law. But surely you think you can have a rich, deep colour, even if it can't sparkle. Surely a bold, warm red is innocent enough. Oh, you sweet, optimistic soul. Let's talk about velvet. Let's say you've made peace with no purple and no gold. Fine. Surely you can have a nice rich red. Sit down. Crimson and scarlet velvet were pinned firmly to the upper rungs of the ladder. Earls and above, thank you very much. The deep blood-bright reds were status made visible, the kind of colour that announced you mattered before you'd opened your mouth. For everyone below that lofty perch, that gorgeous crimson velvet was as forbidden as the crown jewels. You could look at it. You could want it. You could weep gently into your perfectly legal brown wool. But wear it. Only if your title was long enough to need its own coat of arms. Why red, of all things? Because a truly deep, even crimson was monstrously hard to achieve. The richest red dyes were imported, costly and temperamental, and getting them to take evenly across expensive velvet was a feat of money and skill combined. The result was a colour so saturated and so plainly pricey that it practically shouted its own value. A man in crimson velvet was wearing a small fortune, and everyone who saw him knew it instantly. That visibility is exactly why the law wanted it locked away at the top. So the statutes drew the line, and they drew it high. Crimson and scarlet velvet sat with the earls, the dukes, the great men of the realm. These were people whose names you'd have heard, whose lands stretched past the horizon, whose dinners involved more meat than you'd see in a year. The blazing red was theirs, a banner they wore on their backs, and the further down the ladder you went, the more that colour curdled from luxury into evidence of a crime. Now, here's where it stings. Velvet itself is a sensory miracle. It's soft, it's deep, it drinks the light and feels like warm shadow under your fingers. Dye it crimson, and you've created something close to wearable royalty. And it is precisely this, the softness, the richness, the sheer pleasure of it, that you are forbidden. The law isn't just denying you a colour, it's denying you a feeling, reserving the nicest texture in the kingdom for the people who least need extra comforts in their lives. Picture the scene if you ignored the rule. You stride out in your magnificent forbidden crimson, feeling for one glorious moment like a man of consequence, and every single person who passes you performs the same rapid calculation. That colour, that fabric on that man, impossible, illegal, suspicious. You haven't elevated yourself in their eyes. You've simply announced in the loudest possible way that you're wearing a violation. It's the fashion equivalent of walking down the street holding a sign that reads, "Please report me." That's the cruel genius of the whole arrangement. The more spectacular the thing you wear above your station, the more spectacularly you advertise the crime. There's no sneaking crimson velvet. It is, by design, the most attention-grabbing fabric available, which makes it the worst possible thing to wear if your goal is to not get caught. You'd be smuggling contraband that glows. So the deep reds join the growing graveyard of things you may not have. No purple, no gold, no scarlet, no crimson, no velvet softness against your skin. The list of the forbidden is getting long, and the morning is young. You begin to wonder what exactly the law will permit you to wear, and whether the answer depends less on taste and more on something colder and more specific, namely the number attached to your name. Which brings us, unavoidably, to the question of money. Here's where things get personal. Silk. Smooth, cool, luxurious silk. The fabric your whole heart longs for. And whether you are allowed to wear it comes down to one brutally specific number. Your income. Under the rules, if you earned less than £20 a year, silk was simply not for you. Full stop. Climb up the income ladder, and you unlocked a little, like a medieval loyalty program with terrible rewards. So your right to wear a soft shirt was tied directly to your tax bracket, which means a nosy official could, in theory, deny you a blouse based on your annual earnings. Imagine being turned away from a fabric because your salary wasn't impressive enough. This is the moment the laws stop being about lofty titles and start being about cold, hard pounds and shillings. Because not everyone fit neatly into duke or peasant. There was a whole messy middle, tradesmen, merchants, professionals, who didn't have grand bloodlines but did have money. And the law, ever determined to keep everyone sorted, simply attached fabrics to income thresholds, hit a certain yearly figure and a door opened, fall below it, and the door stayed shut no matter how badly you wanted in. So silk got a price of admission, and that price was your earnings. Below £20 a year, you were locked out entirely, no silk gracing your back, your sleeves, or anywhere else. Climb into the bracket above and you might be permitted a little silk in certain limited forms, but nothing too grand. And so on, up the ladder, each rung unlocking slightly nicer textures, like the world's least fun reward chart. The fabric you could legally touch was a direct public readout of how much you brought home. Sit with how invasive that is. Today, your income is a private, slightly awkward thing you'd rather not discuss at parties. In Tudor England, your income was something you were expected to display on your own body, in the form of fabric. Your clothes effectively announced your earnings to everyone you met. A man in fine silk wasn't just stylish. He was visibly solvent. A man in coarse wool wasn't just plain. He was visibly not quite £20 a year. Your shirt was a financial statement, and the enforcement side of this is where it tips fully into the absurd. The rules allowed for people to be challenged about their clothing, required, on the spot, to justify the finery they were wearing by proving they had the income to back it up. So picture it. You're out in your nice silk doublet, feeling rather pleased, and someone with authority and a suspicious squint asks you to demonstrate that you earn enough to legally own the sensation of softness. You are, in effect, being asked to provide receipts for your own shirt. It turns getting dressed into a kind of audit. Before you put on anything nice, you have to ask, not does this suit me, but can I prove I'm allowed to feel this comfortable? The fabric against your skin becomes a claim, and claims can be questioned, and questioned claims can become fines. Comfort itself is now a thing you might have to defend in front of a stranger. So you do the grim arithmetic. You count your meagre income, you compare it to the silk threshold, and you arrive, as you suspected, on the wrong side of the line. No silk for you. You set it down with all the other forbidden pleasures, and you turn, hopefully, to the next contender for your back. Surely sturdy, respectable velvet in a sensible colour is within reach for a hard-working person. And once again, the law has thoughts. Many, many thoughts. Speaking of fabrics that demanded paperwork, let's discuss velvet more broadly, because it wasn't just the crimson kind that got you in trouble. Velvet of nearly any colour sat high on the protected list, doled out by rank and income like a controlled substance. A gentleman of the right standing might be allowed a velvet doublet. A man one notch lower could wear it on his jerkin but not his cloak, or his hose but not his gown, and so on, in a dizzying spreadsheet of permissions. It was less get dressed and more consult the relevant subsection. If you ever wondered what bureaucracy felt like against bare skin, Tudor velvet had your answer. Here's the part that breaks your brain a little. It wasn't enough to say this rank gets velvet, that rank doesn't. The laws went further, slicing it up by garment. The exact same fabric could be perfectly legal on one part of your body and a violation on another, depending entirely on who you were. Your hose might be allowed a touch of velvet while your gown was forbidden it. A facing or a guard or a little edging might squeak under the rules while a whole velvet coat would land you in trouble. Your wardrobe wasn't an outfit, it was a flowchart. Try to imagine actually getting dressed under this regime. You don't just reach for clothes, you cross-reference them. Velvet doublet, am I the right rank for that? Velvet trim on the jerkin, permitted at my income, or one rung too high. A velvet facing on the sleeve, fine, but a velvet lining, possibly a problem. Every single piece requires a quick legal consultation with yourself. By the time you're dressed, you've done more rule-checking than a man playing an unfamiliar board game with a missing instruction sheet. And this is genuinely the texture of the thing. The law treated velvet less like a fabric and more like a regulated substance, parcelled out in approved doses. A little is fine for you, perhaps, as a small allowable garnish, the way a strict diet might permit a single square of something nice. Too much, in the wrong place, on the wrong rank, and you've overdosed on luxury. The pleasure of the fabric came pre-rationed, with the portion set by Parliament. The effect on daily life is a kind of low, constant anxiety stitched into your clothes. You can never fully relax into a nice garment, because some corner of your mind is always running the audit. Is this trim too generous? Is this much velvet appropriate to a man of my standing? Or have I crept a half-inch above my station? You become your own nervous tailor, second-guessing every flourish, because the cost of getting it wrong isn't a fashion faux pas, it's an actual penalty. It also makes a mockery of the whole idea of wanting nice things. In any sane arrangement you save up, you buy something lovely, you enjoy it. Here, you could save up, buy the velvet, have the money for it, and still be breaking the law by wearing it, because wealth alone was never the key. Permission was the key. Rank was the key. You could be perfectly able to afford the fabric and still legally forbidden to enjoy it, which is a special kind of cruelty aimed squarely at anyone with money but no title. So velvet, in nearly all its forms, joins the lengthening list of things that are technically real and practically out of reach for a person like you. You've now lost the colours, lost the sparkle, lost the silk, and lost most of the velvet. Cold and slightly defeated, you start thinking about warmth, about fur, the obvious solution to a freezing morning. And of course, the law has carved up the animal kingdom too, starting with a little white fur worn by exactly one kind of person. Now let's move from fabric to fur, starting at the very top with ermine, that creamy white winter coat of the stoat, dotted with little black tails. You've seen it in every royal portrait framing the faces of kings and queens like edible frosting, and that's exactly the point. Ermine was about as royal as fur could get. It wasn't warmth. It was a statement, a soft white announcement that the person wearing it answered to no one. For you, ordinary dreamer that you are, ermine was as reachable as the moon. You'd have better luck befriending the stoat than legally borrowing its coat. Let's get to know this fur because its reputation is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Ermine is the winter fur of the stoat, a small weaselish creature that turns a brilliant snowy white in the cold months, keeping only the black tip of its tail. Gather enough of those white pelts, arrange them so the little black tail tips dot the surface in a neat pattern, and you get that instantly recognisable spotted white fur. It is frankly beautiful. It is also a logistical nightmare to produce, requiring a great many small animals caught at exactly the right season, which is precisely why it became a marker of staggering status. By the time it reaches a royal robe, ermine isn't really clothing anymore. It's a symbol that happens to be wearable. It says purity, it says majesty, it says the person inside this is set apart from ordinary mortals. Drape it around a monarch's shoulders and you've visually confirmed that they exist on a different plane from the muddy masses. That symbolic weight is exactly why it sat at the absolute peak of the fur hierarchy, untouchable by anyone who wasn't born or married into the higher circles of the realm. So where does that leave you, shivering on this cold Tudor morning, eyeing that gorgeous white fur with naked longing? Exactly nowhere. Ermine is so far above your station that the law barely needs to mention you when forbidding it. You're simply assumed to be out of the question. It's the kind of fur where the rule isn't people of your rank may have a little. It's people of your rank do not appear in this conversation at all. You're not even a footnote in the ermine discussion. And there's a grim little joke buried in here. The fur exists for warmth. Originally, animals grow it to survive the cold, which is the one thing you genuinely need this morning. But by the time humans got hold of it and assigned it a rank, warmth became almost irrelevant. The royals wrapped in ermine weren't huddled and freezing. They had fires, walls, layers, and servants to spare. Meanwhile, you, who could actually use a warm white coat to keep from turning blue, are legally barred from the one fur designed by nature to fight exactly your problem. So you do the only sensible thing and let the ermine dream die quietly, somewhere up near the throne where it lives. You're not getting the moon, and you're certainly not getting the stoat. But fur is a big category, you reason. The whole animal kingdom can't be reserved for royalty. There must be some respectable, warm, legal pelt with your name on it somewhere down the ladder. And there is, but the ladder, it turns out, has many rungs, and finding yours means understanding the entire pecking order of who wears which beast. If ermine sat at the summit, the rest of the furs lined up neatly beneath it like nervous schoolchildren. Sable, dark and glossy and obscenely expensive, was reserved for the very highest noblewomen, duchesses, marchionesses, countesses, and not a single rabbit-trimmed commoner below. Beneath sable came a descending ladder of lesser furs, each tied to a specific rank, until you reached the very bottom, where you'd find the furs assigned to people like you. Humble lambskin, fox, maybe a little cat, possibly something that was very recently a problem in someone's barn. Your fur didn't keep you warm so much as it confirmed your place in line. Let's start at the rich end and work our way down to your sad little corner of it. Sable was the dark jewel of the fur world, deep, lustrous, soft as a secret, and imported at eye-watering cost from far-off northern lands. When the laws turned, around the middle of Elizabeth's reign, to address what great ladies could wear, sable was set aside for the loftiest of them, the duchesses, the marchionesses, the countesses. To wear sable was to declare yourself among the most important women in England, and the law made sure no one could make that declaration falsely by simply buying the fur. Below sable, the hierarchy kept descending, fur by fur, like a menu where the dishes get cheaper and sadder as your eye travels down the page. The finer, rarer pelts clustered near the top with the nobility. The more common, more obtainable furs trickled down toward the lower ranks. Each animal had in effect a social standing of its own, and your right to wrap yourself in it depended entirely on whether your rank and that creature's prestige matched up. And at the bottom, where you live, the offerings are humble indeed. We're talking lambskin, fox, perhaps some cat, the sorts of pelts that came from animals close at hand rather than hauled across continents at vast expense. These were the everyday furs of everyday people. Warm enough, sure, but carrying absolutely no glamour. Nobody ever painted a grand portrait of themselves draped in cat fur. Nobody whispered in awe at a man in fox. These furs kept the cold off and the status low, which was exactly what the law intended. There's something almost poetic about how this maps the animal kingdom onto the human one. The rarer and harder to get the creature, the higher up the social ladder it climbed once it became a coat. Sable, born in distant frozen forests, rode all the way up to the duchesses. The local barn cat, born in, well, a local barn, stayed right down at the bottom with you. Your fur and your station were a match set. Both modest, both assigned, both impossible to upgrade by simply wanting more. So you understand your options now, and they're exactly as charming as you feared. You may keep warm, yes, the law permits you that much, generously allowing you to not freeze to death in the cheap furs of your rank. But you may not keep warm impressively. You may not wrap yourself in anything that turns a head or earns a bow. Your fur is functional, plain, and unmistakably the fur of a man who is precisely where he belongs and going no higher. And here's the truly maddening twist. The thing that turns this whole fur hierarchy from merely unfair into genuinely surreal. It isn't only about which fur you can afford or obtain. It's about whether you, specifically, are allowed to be seen in it at all, because the very same pelt can be perfectly noble on one back and an outright crime on another. To see just how strange that gets, let's follow a single marten as it travels from a lord's shoulders to yours. And here's the genuinely absurd part. It wasn't just owning the fur that mattered, it was wearing it while being the wrong person. A marten pelt on a nobleman's shoulders was elegance. The exact same marten pelt on your shoulders was a violation. Same animal, same fur, same stitching, totally different legal outcome depending on whose neck it was wrapped around. It's a bit like a world where a sandwich is gourmet when a rich man eats it, and a misdemeanor when you do. The fur didn't change. You changed it, simply by being you, which the law considered a deeply suspicious thing to be. Let's really sit inside this strangeness, because it reveals the whole rotten logic of the system. Imagine a single, beautiful marten pelt, glossy, warm, finely dressed. Wrap it around the shoulders of a man of suitable rank, and it is simply correct. Right. The natural order made visible. Now lift that identical pelt off his shoulders and lay it across yours, and without changing a single thread, you have transformed it into evidence of wrongdoing. The fur is innocent. You are the contraband. This is the part that should make your head spin while you stand here in the cold. In any sensible understanding of the world, a thing is either fine to wear or it isn't. But here, the fur's legality lives entirely in the identity of the wearer. It's not the object that's regulated, it's you. The marten is just along for the ride. You could pass that same pelt back and forth between a lord and yourself all morning, and it would flicker between tasteful and illegal with every handoff, like some bizarre game of hot potato refereed by Parliament. The sandwich comparison really does hold up, as ridiculous as it sounds. Picture a meal that's a delicacy in one man's hands and a punishable offence in another's, the only variable being the social standing of the person chewing. That's your fur situation exactly. The substance is irrelevant. The status is everything. The law has decided that some pleasures are not pleasures at all but privileges, and privileges, by definition, must be denied to most people, or they stop feeling like privileges. And notice what this does to your sense of self. The law isn't really telling you that fur is dangerous, or that this particular animal is special. It's telling you that you are the problem. You are the thing that contaminates an otherwise perfectly acceptable pelt. Your rank is treated almost like a stain you carry, one that seeps into anything fine you touch and turns it criminal. Wear the marten, and you haven't done anything to the marten. You've simply revealed publicly that you dared to reach above the shelf assigned to you. It also explains why these laws needed enforcing so relentlessly. If the rule were simply this fur is banned, that would be easy. Ban the fur, done. But the rule is this fur is banned for you and fine for him, which means enforcement requires knowing exactly who everyone is at all times. The whole system rests on the watchers being able to look at a man in marten and instantly judge whether he's entitled to it, which is, of course, the entire reason the clothes had to be legible in the first place. The snake eats its own tail. So you grasp the deepest principle of the Tudor wardrobe now. It was never really about cloth or colour or fur at all. It was about you, and about keeping you exactly where you were. The marten doesn't betray you, your station does. With that grim clarity settling in, you turn from the luxuries you can't have towards something stranger, the things you're not merely forbidden to wear, but legally required to. Starting with a very specific, very humble cap you'll be expected to put on this Sunday whether you like it or not. Let's step away from luxury for a moment and talk about something you are legally required to wear, the humble wool cap. Under the Cappers Act of 1571, nearly every man and boy over the age of 6 who wasn't gentry had to wear a knitted woolen cap on Sundays and holidays, or pay a fine for every single day he forgot. This wasn't about style. Caps had actually gone out of fashion, which was the whole problem. The English wool trade was struggling, so the government simply made hats compulsory. Imagine being fined for going to church bareheaded because the economy needed your scalp to support local industry. Take a second to appreciate the sheer audacity of this. Most of the laws so far have been about stopping you from wearing things. This one flips it around entirely. This one drags you out of bed and forces a specific object onto your head whether you want it there or not. You're no longer just forbidden the good stuff. You're now conscripted into wearing the boring stuff, by order of Parliament, on pain of a fine. Your skull has been volunteered for national service, and the reasoning is so wonderfully transparently cynical. There was no grand moral principle here, no concern for your modesty or your warmth or your immortal soul. The cappers, the people who made these caps for a living, were struggling, because fashion had moved on and nobody wanted their product anymore. So rather than let an unfashionable industry fade away like industries do, the government simply outlawed the alternative. If people won't buy caps, make them illegal not to. Problem solved, freedom slightly dented. The details are precise in a way that's almost charming. The cap had to be wool. It had to be made in England by the proper trade of cappers, finished correctly. You had to wear it on Sundays and holidays, the days when everyone gathered in public and could be conveniently observed. And if you didn't, a fine for every single day you went without, a real sum, the sort of money a working person actually felt. So your bare head wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a recurring daily charge. Picture your Sunday now. You're heading to church, your mind on whatever a Tudor mind dwells on, survival, sin, the weather, the suspicious cough your neighbours had all week. And before you step out the door, you must remember the cap. Not because it's cold, not because it suits you, not because anyone admires it, but because forgetting it costs money and the wool industry is watching. You adjust this slightly itchy lump of compulsory patriotism on your head and trudge off to worship, fully compliant. There's something almost insulting about being made to prop up an entire trade with your forehead. You didn't ask for the capper's troubles. You have troubles of your own, most of them involving not freezing or starving. And yet here you are, an unpaid walking advertisement for a struggling craft, your head dressed not by choice but by statute. The cap doesn't express you, it expresses fiscal policy. So you wear it, of course, because the fine is real and your purse is thin. You join the great shuffling crowd of capped men and boys filing into church every Sunday, a sea of identical wool lumps, each one a tiny monument to government desperation. And as you stand there, scalp itching, you might wonder where these caps even come from, and why exactly they couldn't just let you buy a nicer one from somewhere else. Which brings us to an even older, even pettier rule about exactly whose cap you're allowed to wear. While we're on the subject of mandatory headgear, it gets better, because the cap rules came with a side of fierce economic patriotism. Going back decades, foreign-made caps were banned outright, with fines for anyone caught wearing imported headwear. Your cap had to be made in England by English cappers, from English wool, finished by the proper English trade, or you were technically a criminal in a hat. It was protectionism stitched directly onto your head, so no smuggling in a stylish little number from the continent. The Crown wanted your money circulating at home, and it was willing to police your forehead to make sure it did. This rule is older than the compulsory cap rule, and it shows you just how long the government had been fretting over the contents of your head. Going back to the late 1400s, Parliament had already decided that a foreign cap on an English head was a small act of economic treason. The logic was simple and ruthless. Every penny you spent on a cap made abroad was a penny that didn't go to an English capper, so they closed the loophole the only way they knew how, by making the foreign option illegal. It's worth sitting with how strange this is as a concept. You're being told not just what to put on your head, but where that object must have been born. The cap's nationality matters. A cap is a cap is a cap, you might think. A lump of wool shaped to a skull, identical in function no matter who knitted it. But not in Tudor England. Here, an identical cap is fine if it came from an English workshop, and a fineable offence if it slipped in from across the water. The wool doesn't know the difference. The law insists you must, and it locks the whole thing together beautifully in the most aggravating way. One rule says you must wear a cap. Another rule says that cap must be English. Stack them, and you've got a closed system. Your head is required to be covered, and it's required to be covered specifically by domestic product. There's no escape route, no clever workaround, no stylish import to relieve the monotony. You are, head to toe, a captive customer of the English wool trade, and your loyalty is enforced by fines. Imagine trying to be even slightly fashionable under these conditions. Word reaches you of some elegant little cap they're wearing on the continent, something finer, something with a bit of flair. You'd love it. You can picture it. And it is completely off limits, not because it's too grand for your rank, though that's its own minefield, but simply because it was made in the wrong country. Your sense of style is hemmed in by international trade policy. The borders of fashion are quite literally national borders. So you give up on imported flair the way you've given up on everything else this morning, and you resign yourself to your honest, regulation, homegrown lump of wool. There's a grim consistency to it, at least. Between being forced to wear a cap and being forced to wear an English one, your head has fewer freedoms than the rest of you, which is saying something given how little freedom the rest of you has. And here's the thing, at least the cap is plain, modest, beneath notice. The truly dangerous garments, the ones that drew the most ink and the most outrage, were the ones that tried to be noticed. The ones that grew and grew and grew until they became a public menace. So set your dutiful little cap aside and let's talk about the single most ridiculous thing a Tudor neck ever endured, the ruff. Now, let's turn to the single most ridiculous object in the entire Tudor wardrobe, the ruff. What began as a modest little frill at the neck slowly, insanely, ballooned into an enormous pleated cartwheel of starched linen that made the wearer look like their head was being served on a platter. The wealthier you were, the bigger and crisper your ruff, until courtiers were wandering around unable to turn their heads or feed themselves properly. It was a fashion arms race fueled entirely by starch and ego. And naturally, because this was Tudor England, even your ridiculous neck pancake was subject to opinion from very high places. Let's trace how this monstrosity came to be, because it didn't start as disaster. It started as a sensible little detail, a small ruffle where your shirt gathered at the neck, a tidy frill, nothing alarming. But fashion has a way of finding a thing people like and then ruining it through sheer competitive enthusiasm. The frill got a little bigger, then a little bigger. Then someone discovered starch, and the whole project spiraled into madness. Starch was the secret weapon, the substance that turned a soft frill into a rigid architectural feature. Soak the linen, stiffen it, and you could pleat it into deep, crisp folds that held their shape and stuck out from the neck like the spokes of a wheel. Suddenly the ruff wasn't draping, it was projecting, and once it could be made bigger and stiffer, the only question left was how big and how stiff anyone dared to go. The answer, in a society obsessed with out-displaying your neighbours, was alarmingly. This is where the arms race kicks in, and it's genuinely funny in a tragic sort of way. Because the bigger your ruff, the more linen you needed, the more skilled the laundering, the more starch, the more time and money poured into the upkeep. A vast, crisp, blinding white ruff was a walking advertisement that you could afford to waste enormous resources on a collar. So the rich kept inflating theirs, and the slightly less rich kept straining to keep up, and the whole thing escalated like a contest no one remembered agreeing to enter. The practical consequences were spectacular. At the extreme, these ruffs grew so wide and so stiff that they genuinely interfered with living. You couldn't easily turn your head. You couldn't comfortably bring food to your own mouth without performing a small engineering feat. Some of the truly dedicated had to use special long-handled implements just to eat, because their magnificent collar had placed their face out of reach of their own hands. Imagine being so fashionable you required a specialised tool to feed yourself. That's commitment, or possibly a cry for help. And of course, none of this was free of judgment from above. In a kingdom where the authorities had opinions about your cap, your colour and your fur, you can be quite sure they had opinions about a collar the size of a small table. The ruff became a symbol of exactly the kind of runaway excess the laws were forever fretting about. Vain, expensive, foreign-influenced, and growing out of control. It practically begged for regulation, and regulation, as you'll see, was happy to oblige. So as you stand there contemplating whether to attempt a ruff of your own, modest, of course, befitting your station, understand that you're not just choosing a collar. You're stepping into a battlefield of starch and status, one where going too big invites mockery from below and scrutiny from above. And the scrutiny from above is real, because somewhere out there, officials were taking the absurdity of necks very seriously indeed. Because here's the thing about ruffs getting completely out of control. The Crown noticed. Elizabeth, never one to let her subjects out-sparkle good sense, took aim at monstrous ruffs and overlong swords alike, and officials were reportedly posted to keep an eye on exactly how absurd people's collars had become. Meanwhile, fashion victims propped these monsters up with hidden wireframes and stiffeners called support asses just to keep the whole structure from collapsing into their soup. So picture it. You, in a linen disc the size of a wagon wheel, held up by secret scaffolding, hoping the man at the gate decides your neck is within the legal limit today. Let's start with the engineering, because the lengths people went to are genuinely incredible. Starch alone could only hold a ruff up so far before gravity won, and the whole magnificent thing wilted into a sad droop. So the truly committed cheated. Underneath the linen, hidden from view, they installed support structures, wireframes bent into shape, stiffened bands, devices built for the sole purpose of holding a collar aloft. The ruff you admired from across the room was secretly a small construction project, propped up like a tent in a stiff breeze. So already you have a sense of how seriously people took this nonsense. They were building concealed scaffolding into their clothing to win a contest about necks. And into this fevered atmosphere of competitive collars, the authorities waded with their usual enthusiasm for telling people to calm down. The ruff, like everything fashionable and excessive, drew official disapproval, lumped in with the broader campaign against extravagance that the proclamations loved to thunder about. And it wasn't just stern words. By the accounts that have come down to us, the Queen's displeasure with monstrous excess turned practical, with people appointed to keep watch over exactly how far things had gone, the size of ruffs, the length of swords, the general question of whether a given subject was carrying their vanity past the legal line. Picture being stopped not for what your clothing was made of, but for how aggressively large it had become. Your collar could be too big. There was apparently a limit, and a man whose job it was to enforce it. The mental image this produces is almost too good. You approach the gate of the city in your finest, your ruff inflated to its most impressive dimensions, secretly braced by a hidden frame, blindingly white from hours of laundering, and there stands an official, eyeing your neck with professional suspicion, mentally measuring whether your magnificent collar has crossed from fashionable into punishable. Your entire morning's effort, the starch, the wire, the careful pleating, hangs on whether one board functionary decides your neck is within bounds today. It captures the whole spirit of these laws so perfectly. A society where you can be inflated with pride one moment and deflated by a man with a mandate the next. Where your most elaborate self-expression exists at the pleasure of an inspector. The ruff was supposed to announce your status and your taste, and instead it announced you to the very people most eager to take you down a peg. The bigger you went, the more you were seen, and being seen, in Tudor England, was rarely a good thing if you had any ambitions above your rank. So you make your nervous calculations about exactly how large a collar you dare to attempt, knowing that too modest invites scorn, and too grand invites the gate. And as you do, your eye drifts downward, away from the dangerous territory of the neck, toward another region of the Tudor body that fashion and absurdity had conspired to inflate to ridiculous proportions. There's no dignified way to introduce it, so let's just get on with the codpiece. Gentlemen, we need to have a conversation about the codpiece, and there's no graceful way into it. This was a padded, often wildly exaggerated pouch, worn at the front of a man's hose, and during the height of the fashion it grew to sizes that can only be described as confidently architectural. It was stuffed, shaped, decorated, and in some cases used as a handy little pocket, which raises questions we will not be answering tonight. It started as practical coverage, and rapidly became a billboard of masculine swagger. Nothing says subtle Renaissance dignity quite like a man strolling into court wearing a heavily upholstered statement piece below the belt. Let's trace how this thing came to exist, because like the ruff, it began with a genuinely practical problem. Men's hose were essentially two separate legs, and where those legs met there was, inevitably, a gap. The codpiece started life as a simple flap to cover that gap, a modest, sensible solution to an awkward bit of tailoring. Nobody was meant to look at it. It was the fabric equivalent of a polite cough. And then, as Tudor fashion did with absolutely everything, it got out of hand. The modest flap began to be padded, then shaped, then enlarged, embellished, and thrust forward into the world as a feature rather than a fix. What had been a discreet bit of coverage transformed into a bold, jutting, impossible-to-ignore centerpiece of the male silhouette. It went from, please don't look here to please, by all means, look here and be impressed. The result was a fashion that strode through court announcing a man's confidence before the rest of him had finished entering the room. These things could be substantial, decorated, even slashed and trimmed to draw the eye, which they emphatically did. A well-dressed Tudor gentleman was making a statement with this pouch, and the statement was not a quiet one. It said, with all the subtlety of a trumpet, that here was a man entirely unburdened by modesty. And then there's the detail that tips the whole thing from merely absurd into genuinely unhinged. Some men use the codpiece as actual storage. A small pouch is a small pouch after all, and waste not, want not. So the very thing engineered to broadcast manly swagger could, on a practical day, double as a place to tuck away small items. We will, as promised, leave the implications of this firmly alone, except to note that reaching into one's codpiece for a coin in polite company must have been quite the moment. Step back and marvel at where the era's logic has led. This is a society that fined you for the wrong hat, denied you silk over your income, and stationed men at gates to judge your collar, and the same society looked at a padded pouch at the front of a man's trousers and collectively decided, yes, bigger, much bigger, and put some decoration on it. The same culture that policed your dignity at the neck abandoned it entirely below the belt. Consistency was never the Tudor strong suit. But the codpiece wasn't some lone act of madness floating in a sea of restraint. It was just the loudest member of a much larger family of inflation, because Tudor fashion's true obsession was making the human body bigger than it actually was, in nearly every direction. The codpiece simply applied that obsession to the most attention-grabbing location possible. To understand the full silhouette of the era, the great swollen, padded shape of the fashionable Tudor man, we need to talk about stuffing, specifically about the strange art of bombast. And the codpiece wasn't the only thing being aggressively stuffed. Welcome to the golden age of bombast, the practice of padding out your clothes with horsehair wool, rags, even bran, to achieve the fashionable silhouette of the day. Hose were puffed into great round melons, doublets were padded into the famous peascod belly, a drooping, swollen front that made fashionable men look vaguely pregnant and very pleased about it. You weren't wearing clothes so much as wearing furniture, and if your padding sprang a leak, you could quite literally find yourself trailing a slow stream of bran across the floor like a deflating, well-dressed scarecrow. Let's define the madness properly. Bombast was simply the stuffing, the soft material crammed inside garments to give them shape and bulk they wouldn't otherwise have. Horsehair, wool, rags, scraps, even bran, all packed into doublets and hose to inflate the wearer into the fashionable form of the moment. The clothes weren't fitted to the body. The body was buried inside the clothes, which had a shape and an agenda all their own. The silhouette this produced was deeply strange, and it's worth picturing in full. Up top the doublet swelled into the peascod belly, a padded, rounded, drooping front that bulged out and downward over the waist. The fashionable man didn't have a flat stomach or a natural curve. He had a deliberate engineered paunch, a swollen front that everyone agreed was the height of elegance. It made grown men look softly, proudly expectant, and they wore it with total conviction. Down below, the hose got the same treatment, puffed and padded into great rounded shapes, sometimes ballooning out from the hips like the man had stuffed 2 melons into his shorts and called it style. The overall effect was a body inflated at the front and around the hips, stiff and bulky and entirely artificial. You looked less like a person and more like a beautifully dressed item of upholstered furniture that had learned to walk. And living inside one of these creations must have been an experience. You're carrying padding everywhere, heat trapping, movement restricting, bulk adding stuffing crammed into every fashionable garment. You can't move freely, you can't cool down. You're essentially wearing a small fabric-wrapped storage unit of horsehair and rags. Also, your outline matches the fashion of the day. Comfort was never the point. The point was the shape, and the shape was a lie your tailor told on your behalf. But the truly glorious risk, the detail that makes this whole fashion worth the price of admission, is the failure mode. All that loose stuffing was packed inside fabric and fabric tears, so the dignified, swollen, peascod-bellied gentleman was always one bad seam away from catastrophe. A rip in the wrong place and the bombast began to escape, your magnificent silhouette slowly deflating as a quiet trickle of bran or horsehair leaked out and trailed behind you across the floor. Picture it. A man at court, the very image of fashion, gradually shrinking and shedding stuffing as he walks, leaving a sad little path of evidence in his wake. That's the Tudor body in full then, a padded, inflated, structurally unsound monument to vanity, perpetually at risk of springing a leak. And the era wasn't content merely to inflate you, it also wanted to decorate you, to layer ornament on top of bulk, which is where things get even more elaborate and even more regulated because the next fashion involved deliberately attacking your own expensive clothing with a knife. Let's talk about slashing. Let's talk about slashing, because the Tudors found a way to make destroying your clothing fashionable. Slashing meant deliberately cutting slits into the outer fabric of a garment so the contrasting lining could be pulled through and puffed out, turning your sleeves into a series of dramatic little fabric explosions. It looked expensive because it was expensive. You needed 2 beautiful fabrics to ruin one of them artfully. So the rich walked around in garments that appeared to have lost a knife fight on purpose, while you, in your single sensible layer, had nothing underneath to puff through the slashes except a draft and disappointment. Let's make sure the technique is clear, because it really is as wonderfully wasteful as it sounds. You take a fine outer garment, a doublet, a sleeve, whatever, and you cut slits into it, on purpose, with intent. Then you reach underneath to a second fabric, the lining, ideally in a contrasting colour, and you tug little puffs of it out through each slit so they bloom on the surface. The finished effect is a garment dotted and striped with little bursts of a different cloth, like the outfit is gently exploding in slow motion. The reason this screamed wealth is pure, beautiful excess. To slash a garment well, you needed 2 good fabrics, not 1. You needed an outer layer fine enough to be worth showing off, and an inner layer fine enough to be worth showing through. And then, having acquired both at considerable cost, you deliberately took a blade to one of them. The whole point was to demonstrate that you had so much nice fabric you could afford to cut it up for fun. It was conspicuous destruction, Vandalism is a status symbol. Think about what that signals. In a world where most people owned barely any clothing, and what little they had was patched and repatched until it dissolved, here were the wealthy slicing perfectly good cloth to ribbons because the resulting puffs looked nice. It's the fashion equivalent of lighting a fire with money. The damage was the message. A slashed garment said, "I am so far above scarcity that I treat fine fabric as a thing to be artistically wounded. Now look down at yourself and feel the gap open up. The whole trick depends on having two fabrics, an outer and a contrasting inner that's worth revealing. And you, on your cold and humble morning, are doing well to have one. You are a single sensible layer, and beneath it is not a gorgeous contrasting lining, but your actual skin, possibly some equally humble cloth, and the persistent cold. If you slashed your one decent garment, you wouldn't reveal a tasteful burst of coloured silk. You'd reveal a hole and a draught, and the unmistakable fact that you just ruined the only good thing you owned. So slashing, like nearly everything else, turns out to be a pleasure built for people who already have too much. It requires surplus fabric, surplus money, surplus confidence, and surplus is the one thing your rank denies you. You could no more participate in this fashion than you could host a feast. The entry fee is abundance, and abundance is not on your menu. You can only watch the rich wander past in their artfully shredded finery, blooming with contrasting puffs, and quietly mourn your own intact, boring, single layer. And of course even this had its limits and its rules, because the moment a fashion became a marker of wealth, the laws took an interest. But slashing was only one way to load a garment with expensive ornament. There were others, finer, glintier, more obviously precious, and they too came with strict instructions about exactly who was allowed to shimmer. So let's talk about the threads of actual gold and silver that the law watched almost as closely as the metals themselves. Now suppose you got clever and thought, fine, I'll keep my plain wool, but I'll just decorate it a little. Stop right there. The decoration itself was regulated. Embroidery with gold or silver thread, spangles, jewelled buttons and fancy garnishing all sat on the protected list, tied once again to rank. A little glittering thread on the wrong man's cuff was just as illegal as the velvet underneath it. The law wasn't only watching what your clothes were made of, it was watching what you'd glued, stitched, and sparkled onto them afterward. There was quite literally a legal limit to your bedazzling. This is the loophole you naturally reach for, and the law was waiting for you. Of course, it occurs to you to keep your honest, approved fabric and simply jazz it up. Add a bit of fine embroidery here, a few glinting spangles there, a handsome jewelled button or two. The fabric stays legal, you just enhance it. Clever, and completely doomed, because the Tudors had already thought of that and slammed it shut. The ornament was ranked just like the cloth. Consider gold and silver thread, the glittering favourite of anyone wanting to lift a garment from plain to dazzling. Real metal thread, embroidered into a pattern, turned ordinary cloth into something that caught the light and announced money. And so it was reserved, doled out by rank in the same careful descending ladder as everything else. A man of suitable standing could embroider away. A man below that line caught stitching gold onto his cuffs was committing the same kind of offence as if he'd worn the forbidden velvet outright. The sparkle was the crime. The same went for the smaller flourishes, the spangles, those little glittering metal ornaments sewn onto flash and shimmer, the buttons set with stones, the various forms of garnishing that took a sober garment and dressed it up. None of it floated free of the rules. All of it was watched, ranked and assigned. The law had opinions not just about the canvas, but about every brushstroke you might add to it. What this reveals is just how total the system was. It wasn't enough to control the raw materials of your outfit. The authorities reached all the way down to the finishing touches, the little personal embellishments that might let a clever person hint at more status than they were owed. They understood correctly that a plain garment cleverly decorated could do almost as much social work as a fine one. So they closed that door too. Your right to add even a glint of glamour was rationed by rank, and it produces a genuinely oppressive picture of getting dressed. You can't have the good fabric, you can't have the good colour, you can't have the good fur, and now you can't even take your permitted boring fabric and improve it, because improvement itself is licensed. Every avenue toward looking like a bit more than you are has been mapped, ranked, and blocked. The system anticipated your creativity and made your creativity illegal. There was truly a legal ceiling on how much you were allowed to shine, and it sat very low over your head. So you abandon the dream of a tastefully sparkling cuff and stand there in your unembellished, unimproved, fully compliant dullness. By now you've noticed a pattern. Nearly everything desirable is foreign in spirit, costly and forbidden. And that's not an accident, because the Crown had developed a specific, simmering resentment toward foreign luxury that ran underneath all of this. The good stuff wasn't just expensive, much of it came from abroad, and that to the Tudor mind made it not merely extravagant but faintly unpatriotic. Let's talk about the deep suspicion of foreign fashion. Let's address the wider mood, because the Crown wasn't just anxious about rank, it was anxious about foreigners, specifically their fabrics. Proclamations grumbled openly about the superfluity of unnecessary foreign wares draining good English coin abroad. Spanish, French, and Italian fashions were glamorous, fashionable, and therefore deeply suspect. Importing luxury textiles was seen as a kind of patriotic betrayal dressed up as a nice jacket. So that elegant continental silhouette you've been admiring wasn't just expensive, it was practically a political statement, and not one the government wanted you making with your shoulders. To understand the resentment, follow the money, because that's exactly what the Crown was doing. England produced wool, lots of it, gloriously, foundationally. Wool was the backbone of the whole economy, but the truly glamorous luxuries, the silks and the fine worked fabrics and the latest dazzling fashions, often came from abroad, from the workshops of Italy and France and beyond. So every time a wealthy English subject bought into the latest continental trend, English coin sailed out of the country and into foreign pockets. To a government obsessed with its own wool trade that was close to treason in fabric form. So the proclamations didn't just scold people for dressing above their rank. They scolded them for dressing too foreign. They grumbled about the flood of unnecessary imported finery, the superfluity of foreign wares, the way fashionable folk seemed determined to enrich every country but their own. The complaint had a moralizing edge to it. All this foreign luxury was wasteful, excessive, a sign of a people losing their heads over baubles from across the sea. But underneath the moralizing sat the cold economic fear. The money was leaving, and the wool was piling up unsold, and this gave foreign fashion a strange double danger. It wasn't only that a continental silk might be above your rank or beyond your income, it was that the very foreignness of it carried a whiff of disloyalty. Dressing in the height of Italian or French fashion didn't just say I am wealthy and stylish, it whispered I would rather enrich Italy than England. In a country forever nervous about foreign powers, foreign faiths, and foreign influence, even your wardrobe could be read as a quiet vote for the other side. Picture then the layered crime of simply admiring a beautiful imported garment. First, it might be too fine for your station, strike 1. Second, it might be beyond your income, strike 2. And third, it's foreign, draining coin abroad and flouting the patriotic preference for honest English cloth, strike 3. A single elegant continental jacket could manage to offend the social order, the income ladder, and the national economy all at once, just by hanging on your shoulders. That's remarkable efficiency, really, for a piece of clothing. So the gorgeous foreign silhouette you've caught yourself longing for all morning turns out to be one of the most loaded things you could possibly wear. It's not a neutral fashion choice, it's a statement, and the statement is one the Crown actively wished you wouldn't make. Your wardrobe was supposed to keep money at home and loyalties clear, and a stylish import did the opposite on both counts. Better, the law implied, to stick to good plain English stuff and keep your shoulders unpatriotic free. And this points to the deeper engine driving the whole anxious machine, because the people the Crown and the nobility most feared weren't really foreigners at all. They were a rising group of English subjects with fresh money, expensive taste, and a maddening tendency to buy exactly the foreign luxuries the laws were trying to suppress. To understand why the rules existed in the first place, you have to understand the group that made the old order panic, the merchants. Now we arrive at the people who made the whole system twitch, the merchants. Tudor England had a rising class of traders and townsmen who were, awkwardly, getting rich, sometimes richer than the nobles whose ranks they could never join. And what does new money love to do? Dress the part. The horror of a wealthy cloth merchant swanning about in fabrics meant for his betters kept the aristocracy up at night, clutching their crimson velvet. The sumptuary laws were, in large part, a panicked attempt to slam the door on exactly this. You could have all the coin in the world and still be legally forbidden from looking like it. Let's understand who these people were, because they represent the crack in the comforting old ladder. For centuries the theory had been simple. The people at the top had the titles, the lands, and the money, all bundled neatly together. Wealth and rank travelled as a pair, but the growth of trade and towns broke that pairing apart. Suddenly there were merchants, traders, and successful townsmen who had piles of money but no noble blood, wealth without rank, status's most uncomfortable orphan. And these newly rich did the most natural thing in the world. They spent. They bought fine houses, fine furnishings, and above all fine clothes, because clothing was the loudest, fastest way to broadcast that you'd arrived. A merchant who could afford silken velvet wanted to wear silken velvet, and why shouldn't he? He'd earned the coin. To him the fabric was simply a reward for success. To the nobility watching him stroll past, dressed nearly as well as they were, it was a small catastrophe. Because this struck at the entire purpose of the system. The whole comforting idea was that you could read rank off a person's body. But if any merchant with enough money could dress like a lord, then the clothing stopped meaning anything. A fine doublet would no longer signal noble blood. It would just signal a good year in the wool trade. The visual order, the thing the nobility cherished most, the instant legibility of who outranked whom, was being blurred by men with full purses and no pedigree. So the laws were, in large part, a defensive wall thrown up by an anxious elite against exactly this threat. By tying the finest fabrics to rank and title, rather than to money alone, the rules made sure that wealth, by itself, couldn't buy the look of nobility. A merchant could become rich, he could not legally become visually noble. The good fabrics were fenced off behind birth and station precisely so that no amount of trade success could vault a man over the wall just by dressing well. And this is the bitter heart of your situation, laid bare. The system was never really about preventing waste or encouraging modesty, whatever the proclamations claimed. It was about keeping the categories sealed. You could have the coin and still be forbidden the cloth, because the cloth was reserved not for the people who could pay for it, but for the people who were born to it. Permission, not payment, was the currency that mattered, and permission was the one thing money couldn't buy. So even in the best case, even if you somehow clawed your way to real wealth in this kingdom, the law had a special ceiling built just for you, low enough to keep you visibly in your place no matter how fat your purse grew. Money could change your life in 100 ways and still leave your wardrobe firmly behind a locked door. And if the rules pressed this hard on rich men, imagine how they pressed on the people with no money and no freedom at all, the servants and apprentices whose clothes weren't even truly their own, which is exactly where we're headed next. If you happen to be a servant or an apprentice this morning, your wardrobe situation is even simpler in the bleakest possible way. It isn't really yours. Servants were dressed according to their master's household and station, kept in plain, sober, sharply limited clothing that announced their position at a glance. No silk, no fine trim, no ideas above your scrubbing. Your outfit existed to reflect the man who employed you, not the person inside it. So while you sweep his hall, you do it in regulation drab, a walking advertisement for someone else's rank. Self-expression was, regrettably, not in your contract. Let's be clear about what this means in practice. A servant didn't wake up and choose an outfit. A servant put on what the household provided, which was determined by the master's standing and the master's preferences, and which was designed to do one job: make you instantly recognizable as a servant. Your clothing was a uniform in everything but name, a clear visual label that said this person works for that household and ranks below nearly everyone you'll meet today. And the limits were tight. The fine fabrics, the rich colours, the soft furs, all of it was even further out of reach for you than for a poor free man, because your clothing wasn't about your own modest aspirations. It was about your master's image. You couldn't be allowed to look too fine, because that would muddy the message. A servant in silk would suggest the household's hierarchy was confused, and confusion was the one thing this whole system was built to prevent. So plain you stayed, by design. There's a strange double bind in this. On one hand, what you wore reflected on your master. A well-kept servant in decent, appropriate clothing made the household look orderly and respectable. So you weren't dressed in rags. You were dressed adequately, even neatly. But on the other hand, you could never be dressed impressively, because impressive belonged to the family, not the staff. You were meant to look cared for, but never elevated, presentable, but never proud. A nicely maintained piece of the household furniture. Think about how thoroughly this erases you. Most people, however poor, at least get to make the small choices about their own appearance, to express some sliver of themselves in what they put on. A servant didn't even get that. The clothes on your back were a statement someone else was making, using your body as the billboard. You were quite literally wearing another man's status. Every morning you got dressed in a costume that said more about your employer than it ever could about you. And the apprentices had it much the same, young, bound to a master for years, kept in sober, modest clothing fitting their lowly learning station. No flash, no finery, nothing that might suggest the apprentice fancied himself the equal of finer folk. You dressed down because dressing down was your assigned role, and stepping out of it, looking above your humble position, invited exactly the kind of trouble the laws everywhere promised. So if you're staff this morning, your day's wardrobe question is mercifully short. You wear what you're given, in the drab that suits your place, and you keep your dreams of finery to yourself. There's a grim simplicity to having the choice removed entirely. At least you're spared the agonizing fabric arithmetic that torments the free and the ambitious. Of course, there was one whole category of person whose clothing the law spent a curiously long time barely mentioning at all, not because they were free, but because the law assumed they belonged to someone too. Let's talk about how the rules treated women. For most of the Tudor century, the apparel laws had a curious blind spot. Women were barely mentioned. The thinking, charming as ever, was that a woman's rank simply flowed from her father or her husband, so regulating her separately seemed unnecessary. She was an accessory to a man's status, legally speaking. That shifted around 1574, when the rules finally turned to address women directly, spelling out which furs and fabrics great ladies could and couldn't wear. So if you're a woman this morning, you've spent decades being a legal footnote, and now you've graduated to being a fully regulated one. Progress of a sort. Let's unpack the original blind spot because it's revealing in the worst way. The early statutes were written as if women barely entered into the matter. The assumption baked into the whole system was that a woman didn't have her own independent rank to display. She had her father's, and then once married her husband's. Her standing was borrowed, on loan from the nearest man, and so the question of regulating her clothing separately seemed almost beside the point. Control the man, the thinking went, and you've controlled the woman attached to him. It's a tidy little piece of logic that quietly erases half the population from the conversation. A woman's clothing wasn't seen as her statement. It was seen as an extension of her household's, governed through the man at its head. If she dressed above her station, that wasn't really her transgression to answer for. It fell to the man responsible for her, the father or husband under whose authority she was assumed to sit. She was, in the eyes of the law, a dependent feature of someone else's rank rather than a person with a station of her own. And then, around the middle of Elizabeth's reign, that changed. The rules turned at last to address women directly, laying out in their own right which fabrics and furs the great ladies of the realm could wear. The finest furs, sable and its lofty companions, were spelled out for the duchesses, the marchionesses, the countesses, with the same careful descending ladder applied to women that had long applied to men. Women had finally been written into the system as subjects of it, rather than as appendages to the men who were. There's a bleak comedy in calling this progress, and yet in a strange way it acknowledged something. To regulate women directly was, however grudgingly, to admit that women's clothing mattered on its own terms, that a great lady's wardrobe was a statement worth controlling, a display of status significant enough to need its own rules. The recognition came wrapped in restriction, as recognition so often did, but it was recognition all the same. You were now important enough to be told what you couldn't wear. So if you're a woman standing here this morning, your relationship to the entire apparel system has shifted from invisible to inescapable. You were once a footnote. Your wardrobe governed second-hand through whichever man owned your rank. Now you're named, ranked, and restricted in your own right. Your furs and fabrics assigned by the same anxious machinery that fretted over everyone else. It's a peculiar sort of promotion, from not worth mentioning to carefully limited, but it's the only kind this kingdom hands out. Either way, man or woman, free or bound, you've now learned the rules for the big, obvious things, the fabrics, the colours, the furs. But the law's reach didn't stop at the major garments. It crept all the way down to your feet, where even the question of what you stood on was a matter of rank. Let's talk about shoes. Let's work our way down to your feet, because even there you weren't safe. Footwear carried its own rules and its own fashions to fall foul of fine leather, decorative pantofleurs and cork-soled mules that lifted you out of the muck and into a higher tax bracket of judgment. Earlier eras had even fretted over the length of pointed toes, the longer points being a luxury of the leisured who didn't have to, walk anywhere useful. So your shoes, like everything else, quietly broadcast your station. There was no such thing as a casual shoe. There was only a shoe that knew its place. Let's start with the simple truth that even at ground level, your footwear was a statement. A pair of fine leather shoes, well made and well kept, told the world you had money to spend below the ankle. Add decorative touches, fashionable shapes, or the elevated cork-soled mules, the pantofleurs that lifted you up out of the filth of the street, and you were broadcasting comfort and status with every step. The person who could afford to keep their feet clean and dry and stylish was visibly a person who didn't trudge through muck for a living. that elevation matters more than it sounds. Tudor streets were, to put it gently, not pleasant underfoot. Mud, waste, and worse. So a shoe or overshoe that physically lifted you above all that wasn't just fashionable, it was a small declaration that you didn't have to wade through the worst of life. The higher and finer your footwear, the more clearly you announced that the grime of the world was beneath you, literally. Your feet, of all things, were doing status work. And the obsession with footwear as a class marker stretched back well before the Tudors into eras that had fretted over the most absurd detail imaginable, the length of your toes. The fashionable shoes of earlier days had grown long, pointed toes that stretched out absurdly far ahead of the actual foot, and the longer the point, the higher the status. Why? Because an enormously long pointed shoe was useless for any kind of real work or fast movement. It announced that you were a person of leisure, someone who never had to chase a runaway animal or hurry across a field, because how could you, in shoes shaped like that? That's the genuinely funny logic of it. The most impractical footwear became the most prestigious precisely because it was impractical. A long-toed shoe was a way of saying, I'm so far above labour that I've deliberately made it harder to walk. Useless in this upside-down world was the whole point. The harder your shoes made it to do anything productive, the more clearly they proved you never had to. Difficulty was the luxury, so even down here, at the very bottom of you, the rules applied. Your feet, like the rest of you, were ranked. Fine footwear, elevated soles, fashionable shapes, all of it sat on the same ladder of permission and status as the silk and the velvet far above. There was no neutral, no casual, no shoe that simply protected your feet without also filing a report on your social standing. Every step you took was a small statement, whether you meant it to be or not. And footwear, it turns out, wasn't even the most aggressively measured thing dangling from a Tudor body. Because where men were concerned, there was another accessory the authorities watched with genuine ruler-in-hand precision, one with an edge to it, literally. If they cared this much about the length of your toes, you can imagine how they felt about the length of your sword. Let's talk steel. Gentlemen with a fondness for a good blade, listen closely. It wasn't only your clothes that came with legal measurements, your weapons did too. As rapiers grew fashionably, absurdly long, the Crown decided enough was enough and set limits on the length of swords and daggers a man could carry. And there are accounts of officials stationed at the city gates to enforce it, snapping off any blade that ran past the legal limit. Imagine strolling proudly into London with your magnificent oversized rapier, only to have a stern man at the gate simply break the end off it like a breadstick. Fashion meet bureaucracy. Let's understand why a sword became a fashion problem in the first place. The rapier wasn't just a weapon. It was an accessory, a status symbol, a thing a fashionable gentleman wore at his hip the way he wore his fine doublet and his enormous collar. And like every other accessory in this status-mad era, it got swept up in the relentless competition to outdisplay everyone else. If a long, elegant rapier looked impressive, a longer one looked more impressive, and so the blades crept outward, growing more absurd with each round of one-upmanship. The trouble is that an extremely long rapier is more than a fashion statement, it's a practical menace. A blade that stretches out to ridiculous lengths is awkward in crowded streets, dangerous in a quarrel, and generally the sort of thing that turns a minor tavern disagreement into a genuine public hazard. So the runaway growth of fashionable swords presented the Crown with the same problem as runaway ruffs, a vanity arms race producing increasingly impractical results. And the Crown's response was, as ever, to set a limit and enforce it. So a maximum length was decreed, and here's where it becomes wonderful. The enforcement, by the accounts handed down, was hands-on. Officials posted at the gates of the city would check the swords coming through, and any blade that exceeded the legal length got broken on the spot. The offending portion simply snapped off. You couldn't talk your way past it. You couldn't argue that your sword was tasteful or necessary. If it was too long, it got shortened. Then and there, by a man whose entire job that day was apparently to be the arbiter of acceptable blade length. Picture the humiliation in full. You've spent good money on a magnificent rapier, the longest and most dashing you could acquire, a clear signal of your style and standing. You approach the city gate with the swagger of a man well armed and well dressed, and the official takes one look, judges your pride to be in violation, and breaks the end off your beautiful sword like he's snapping a dry twig. You enter the city not as a dashing blade, but as a man holding a freshly shortened, slightly pathetic stub of his former glory. It's the rough situation all over again, just with steel instead of starch. The same society that policed the size of your collar, policed the length of your blade, lumping both into the same broad campaign against excess and menace. Whether it was linen around your neck or iron at your hip, the principle held. There was a limit to how far you were allowed to extend yourself into the world, and a man at the gate to enforce it. And the metal at your hip wasn't the only metal the law watched. The era's gentlemen loved to gleam at the heel, on the buckle, anywhere a flash of precious metal could be worked in. Naturally, that glinting too was ranked and rationed, because in Tudor England even your shininess had a ceiling. Let's talk about spurs, gilt, and the forbidden art of sparkling. While we're cataloguing the small metallic ways you could land in trouble, let's not forget the accessories that twinkled. Gilt and silver on your spurs, your swords, your buckles, and your assorted hardware were all bound up in the same rank-based web. A knight might earn his shiny spurs quite literally. A lesser man flashing the same gilt was overstepping. Even the metal jingling at your heels had a social ceiling. The Tudors had managed to regulate not just what you wore, but how much you were legally permitted to gleam. There was apparently such a thing as too much sparkle for your station. Let's begin with the spurs, because they carry a lovely bit of history. To be a knight was, in the old language of chivalry, to win your spurs. The spurs were a literal symbol of knighthood, a mark of rank you earned and then wore at your heels for all to see. So gilt spurs weren't just a flashy bit of hardware. They were a credential, a statement that you belonged to a particular martial elite. And like every credential in this kingdom, they came with rules about who was allowed to display them. So the gleam of gold or silver on your spurs was tied to your standing. The right man, the knight, wore his shining spurs as the visible badge of what he'd earned. A lesser man, strapping on the same glinting metal, was claiming a status he had no right to, dressing his heels in borrowed prestige. The sparkle wasn't decoration, it was assertion, and asserting more than your rank allowed was exactly the kind of overstep the whole system existed to crush. And it didn't stop at spurs. The same principle reached across all the little gleaming bits a fashionable man might accumulate. The gilt on a sword hilt, the silver on a buckle, the precious metal touches worked into clothing and accessories. All of it sat on the familiar ladder, parcelled out by rank, each man permitted only the amount of shine appropriate to his place. The flash of metal on your person was a measurable thing, and the measure was your standing. Step back and marvel at the sheer thoroughness of this. The Tudors had managed to regulate light itself, in a sense, the catch and gleam of metal in the sun, the glint that drew the eye. They'd looked at the simple fact that precious metal sparkles and people notice sparkle, and they decided that even this, even the basic phenomenon of catching the light, needed to be ranked and rationed. There was a legal limit on your lustre. Beyond a certain point, your own shininess became an offence. It tells you everything about how complete the system aimed to be. It wasn't enough to control your fabrics, your colours, your furs, your weapons, your shoes. The authorities reached all the way down to the smallest flash of gold at your heel and said, "That too, that we will measure. Every conceivable channel through which you might signal more than you were, every fabric, every hue, every glint had been mapped and capped. You were allowed to exist, but only at the exact brightness your rank permitted. So you let go of any dream of gleaming spurs or a silver-flashed buckle, and you add them to the towering pile of forbidden sparkle. By now the pattern is total. From your head to your heels, every part of you is governed, and yet there's one region we've circled but not fully examined, the part of you that the era's fashion turned into a genuine showcase, where fine fabric and rank came together in the most unexpected place. Let's talk about your legs. Now consider your legs, which in this era were doing a surprising amount of social heavy lifting. Fashionable hose, fine knitted stockings and elegant garters all helped a gentleman display a well-turned calf, and the quality of the fabric hugging your shins was, of course, governed by the same rules as everything else. A man of standing wore silk stockings that cost a small fortune. A man like you wore honest wool and hoped no one looked too closely. Your legs, in other words, were a billboard, and in Tudor England, even your knees were expected to know their rank. Let's appreciate that the male leg was genuinely a focus of fashion in this era, which feels strange to modern ears but made perfect sense at the time. With the upper body padded and swollen into its peascod-bellied bulk, and the famous codpiece doing its loud work at the front, the eye travelled downward to the legs, which were left relatively trim and on full display. A well-shaped calf in a smooth, close-fitting stocking was a thing a fashionable gentleman wanted to show off. The leg was a stage, and the stocking was the costume, and the costume mattered enormously. A fine knitted silk stocking hugging the leg smoothly and catching the light was an expensive luxury, and an unmistakable one. Silk stockings cost a small fortune and looked it, sleek, refined, the legwear of a man who could afford to dress his shins as carefully as his shoulders. They were exactly the sort of status object the laws loved to fence off, and so the quality of fabric permitted on your legs was governed by rank and income just like everything above. For a man like you, of course, silk stockings were a fantasy. You wore honest wool, sturdy, warm, practical, and entirely unglamorous. There was nothing wrong with wool stockings except that they failed to announce anything except that you were ordinary, which in this status-obsessed world was its own quiet failure. Your legs, like the rest of you, were dressed in the plain truth of your station, and no amount of hoping people wouldn't look too closely could change what the fabric said about you. Even the garters got in on the act. The bands that held your stockings up could themselves be fine or plain, decorative or merely functional, and a fashionable man treated them as one more opportunity to display taste and money. A gentleman's garter could be a thing of some elegance. Yours was a strip of whatever did the job, the smallest accessories, right down to the bands around your knees, had been recruited into the endless work of broadcasting rank. So your legs joined the rest of you as a surface for the law and fashion to govern. From the crown of your head, capped and ranked down through your collar, your padded torso, your gleaming or not accessories, your weapons, your shoes, and now your very calves, there is no part of your body left untouched by the system. You are, head to toe, a fully ranked object, every inch of you assigned its proper, legible, permitted appearance. Self-expression has been replaced comprehensively by classification. And here's the question that's been hovering all along, the one you've been too busy panicking to ask. How was any of this actually caught? You can't fine a man for his collar or break a blade or confiscate a stocking unless you somehow know he's broken the rule. So who exactly was watching? The answer is grim and very Tudor, and it involves your neighbours, your income, and a culture of suspicion that turned the whole kingdom into a courtroom. Let's talk about how you get caught. You might be wondering how any of this was enforced. Surely no one was really checking. Oh, but they were. Local officials had the power to inspect what people wore and demand they justify it. And when challenged, you might be required to produce proof of your income to explain that fancy shirt. Add to that the great Tudor pastime of informing on your neighbours, and you have a society where your envious cousin could report your suspicious new doublet for a share of the trouble. Your wardrobe wasn't private, it was evidence, and everyone around you was a potential witness for the prosecution. Start with the officials, because they had real, formal power. Local authorities were empowered to look at what people were wearing and decide whether it matched their station, and to challenge anyone who appeared to be dressing above themselves. This wasn't a vague social frown, it was a genuine mechanism. A person with authority who could stop you, scrutinise your clothing, and demand an account of yourself based purely on the cut and quality of what you had on. And the account they could demand was a personal one. When challenged, you might be required to prove that your income justified the finery on your back, to demonstrate, in effect, that you earned enough to legally own the silk or the velvet or the trim you were wearing, so your clothing could trigger an inquiry into your finances. That nice shirt wasn't just a garment, it was a claim about your wealth and your rank, and claims could be tested. You could be made to substantiate your own outfit like a man defending a tax return. Then there's the truly insidious part, the informers. Enforcement didn't rest on officials alone, because officials can't be everywhere. It rested, as so much Tudor control did, on the willingness of ordinary people to report one another. A jealous neighbour, a resentful cousin, a rival who didn't care for the new doublet you'd been parading about in, any of them could bring your wardrobe to the attention of the authorities, and where there were rewards or grudges to be had, plenty were willing. This turns the whole social fabric into a surveillance network. Every person who saw you in the street was a potential witness, every acquaintance a possible informant, every gathering an opportunity to be observed and judged, and, if you'd overstepped, reported. You couldn't even enjoy your transgression in the warm company of friends because friends talk and rivals listen. Your finest outfit was most dangerous precisely when most people saw it, which is, of course, the entire reason you'd wear a fine outfit in the first place. Sit with how exhausting that must have been. Getting dressed above your station wasn't a single risk taken once. It was a risk renewed with every person who laid eyes on you, all day, every day you wore the thing. The pleasure of fine clothing depends on being seen in it, and being seen was exactly the danger. You'd have spent the whole day reading the faces around you, wondering who was admiring and who was tallying, who would let it pass and who would quietly mention it to the right official. So the system caught you not through some grand inspectorate, but through the oldest tools there are. Authority above you and suspicion all around you. Your neighbours became your wardens, your income became evidence, and your own outfit became the case against you. And once the case was made, once you were caught dressing above the place assigned to you, what happened next was not a stern talking to. The punishments were real, and they reached into your purse, your closet, and occasionally your freedom. Let's talk about the price of getting caught. So what happened if you were caught dressing above yourself? Nothing good. Penalties could include hefty fines, the forfeiture of the offending garment, and in some cases imprisonment, plus the very real risk of losing any office or position you held. Imagine working for years toward a beautiful coat, finally wearing it out into the world, and watching an official confiscate it on the spot while writing down your name. The clothes weren't just taken, they were taken as a lesson. In Tudor England, a fabulous outfit could cost you your money, your dignity, and occasionally your freedom, all in a single afternoon. Start with the fines, the bread and butter punishment of the whole system. Get caught in fabric or finery above your rank, and you could be hit with a financial penalty real enough to hurt, not a symbolic slap, but a genuine sum extracted from a purse that, for most people, had very little to spare. For a working person, a fine of this kind could be ruinous, the cost of one moment of dressing above yourself echoing through your accounts for a long time afterward. The pleasure was brief, the bill was not. Then there's the forfeiture, which carries a special cruelty. The offending garment itself could simply be taken from you, confiscated, removed, gone. Think about what that means. You didn't just pay a penalty for the thing, you lost the thing entirely. All the money, all the longing, all the saving that went into acquiring that beautiful forbidden item, and the punishment was to have it stripped away. You were left poorer and garmentless, having paid for something you no longer owned. The state didn't just fine your ambition, it repossessed it. And in some cases the consequences climbed higher than money and cloth. Imprisonment was on the table, actual loss of liberty for the crime of dressing wrong. Sit with how staggering that is. You could, in this kingdom, be locked up for wearing the incorrect fabric, not for theft, not for violence, but for the offence of appearing to be of a higher station than the one assigned to you. Your clothing could literally cost you your freedom. There was also the quieter, more insidious danger to anyone who actually held a position worth having, the risk of losing it. For a man with an office, a post, some hard-won place in the world, being caught flouting the apparel laws could threaten that standing. The very ambition that drove you to dress finely could, if caught, destroy the rank you'd built. It was a trap that punished exactly the upwardly mobile people it was designed to suppress. Reach too high in your wardrobe and you could fall in your career. So picture the full scene of getting caught. You've finally got the coat. You've worn it out, felt magnificent for an afternoon, drawn the admiring and the envious eyes alike. And then an official stops you, judges you, and the consequences cascade. The garment stripped from your back, a fine carved out of your savings, your name written down, your liberty and your position suddenly in question. An entire arc of hope and effort collapses in a single encounter, all because you dared to look like more than you were permitted to be. That's the iron underneath all the absurdity. For every funny detail, the mandatory caps, the snapped swords, the deflating Branfield hose, there was a real and serious enforcement waiting for anyone who pushed too far. This was law, with law's teeth. And the most maddening thing of all, the detail that should make you grind your own decaying Tudor teeth, is who got to ignore every bit of it. Because the people writing these rules about excess were themselves the most gloriously excessive dressers in the entire kingdom, let's talk about the hypocrisy at the very top. And here's the part that should make your blood boil as you stand there in your legally approved wool. The people writing and enforcing these laws? Absolute peacocks. Henry VIII dripped with cloth of gold and jewels like a walking treasury, and Elizabeth's wardrobe was famously staggeringly enormous, a deliberate display of dazzling power. The monarch wasn't restraining excess so much as monopolizing it. The whole point of forbidding your purple was to make their purple mean more. So as you button up your dull, dutiful, lawful tunic, take comfort in knowing the person who outlawed your sparkle is, at this very moment, absolutely covered in it. Consider Henry VIII, who issued proclamation after proclamation against excess apparel while being himself one of the most spectacularly dressed men in Europe. This was a king who draped himself in cloth of gold, who glittered with jewels, who treated every public appearance as an opportunity to overwhelm onlookers with sheer magnificence. He outlawed your luxury from a body wrapped in the very finest the world could offer. The hand that signed the restrictions wore rings worth more than your village. His daughter Elizabeth took the contradiction and made it a centerpiece of her reign. Her wardrobe became legendary, an enormous, dazzling collection of gowns and jewels and finery that she deployed deliberately, strategically, as an instrument of power. When Elizabeth appeared before her subjects, glittering and resplendent, she wasn't being frivolous. She was demonstrating in fabric and gemstone that she was utterly beyond them. The same queen who fired off a dozen edicts curbing what her people could wear was herself the most extravagantly dressed person in the realm by a mile. And here's the thing, this wasn't hypocrisy in the sloppy, accidental sense, where the rule makers simply forgot to follow their own rules. It was the entire design. The whole point of forbidding your purple, your gold, your crimson was to concentrate all that meaning at the top. If everyone could glitter, the monarch's glitter would mean nothing. By denying the sparkle to nearly everyone, the crown made its own sparkle priceless. Your restriction was the source of their dazzle. The laws didn't reduce excess, they hoarded it. So the monarch wasn't restraining luxury at all. The monarch was monopolizing it, claiming the brightest, rarest, most magnificent finery as an exclusive possession, and then making sure no one below could approach it. Every forbidden purple, every banned cloth of gold, every fenced-off fur worked to the same end, to make the person at the top shine alone, unrivaled, in a kingdom carefully kept dim around them. Your dullness was, quite literally, the background that made their brilliance pop. Which means that as you stand here in your honest, lawful, thoroughly unremarkable wool, you are playing your assigned part in someone else's spectacle. Your restraint isn't an accident or a misfortune, it's a contribution. You're one of the millions of deliberately plain figures against whom the monarch is designed to gleam. The whole point of you, sartorially speaking, is to not compete. You are the shadow that proves the light. There's a bitter clarity in seeing it laid out so plainly. The laws were never about modesty, never about thrift, never about protecting you from your own extravagance. They were about keeping the sparkle at the top and the dullness everywhere else, forever. And yet, and this is the small, almost funny mercy hiding at the end of all this, even a system this total, this thorough, this obsessively enforced, couldn't actually last. People kept breaking the rules, money kept flowing the wrong way, the whole exhausting machine was straining against reality, and eventually a new king simply gave up. Let's talk about how the entire thing finally collapsed. So how does this grand, fussy, fabric-obsessed empire of rules finally end? Not with a bang, but with a shrug. For all the proclamations, fines, and gateside sword snapping, the laws were a nightmare to enforce and increasingly ignored, especially as money kept flowing into the wrong hands and people simply kept dressing as they pleased. And then, in 1604, the new king, James I, stood before Parliament and effectively swept the whole tangled mess of apparel laws away. Centuries of agonizing over velvet, purple, and the precise legality of your hat gone. After all that, it turns out you could just let people wear what they wanted. Who knew? Let's appreciate why the system was doomed long before anyone formally killed it. The entire scheme depended on a fantasy, that you could freeze society in place, that the categories would hold still if you just policed the clothing hard enough. But society refused to cooperate. Money kept being made by the wrong people. Merchants kept getting rich. The old neat ladder kept blurring no matter how many proclamations were fired at it. You can pass all the laws you like about who may wear silk, but you cannot legislate the economy into staying still, and the economy was very much on the move. And enforcement was a perpetual headache. For all the officials and informers and gateside blade snapping, the sheer scale of the task was impossible. There were too many people, too many garments, too many small daily acts of quiet defiance to ever truly control. People wore what they could get away with, which turned out to be quite a lot. The proclamations had to be reissued again and again precisely because they kept failing. Each new edict was an admission that the last one hadn't worked. The crown was bailing out a boat that leaked from every seam. So by the time James I came to the throne, the whole apparatus was creaking, widely flouted, and arguably more trouble than it was worth. And in 1604, in his early dealings with Parliament, he effectively voided the acts of apparel that his predecessors had laboured over for generations. Just like that, the towering legal edifice of who may wear what came down. The purple, the gold, the velvet, the furs, the caps, the ruffs, all the obsessive ranking simply ceased to be law. Imagine the strange anticlimax of it. Generations of monarchs had fretted and proclaimed and fined and confiscated, building an ever more elaborate code governing the contents of every closet in the kingdom. And the ending wasn't a dramatic rebellion or a great cultural awakening. It was a new king looking at the whole exhausting mess and essentially deciding it wasn't worth the bother. The grand experiment in dressing an entire society by law concluded with a quiet administrative shrug. And the lesson buried in that shrug is almost comical in its simplicity. After all the effort, the colours fenced off, the fabrics ranked, the furs assigned by birth, the swords broken at the gate, the men fined for going to church bareheaded, it turned out the kingdom did not, in fact, collapse when people were allowed to wear what they pleased. The sky did not fall. Society did not dissolve. The thing they'd spent a century terrified of simply happened, and was fine. All that anxiety, all that control, and the great catastrophe they were guarding against was just people getting to choose their own clothes. So that's your day, and your century, in the strange kingdom where your wardrobe was a legal document. You woke up forbidden nearly everything you wanted, policed from your cap to your stockings, watched by your neighbours and judged by your purse, and you lived just long enough to see the whole anxious system give up and let go. You survived getting dressed in Tudor England, which, considering everything, is no small feat. And now, at last, it's time to step back from the velvet and the starch and the snapped swords and reflect on what it all really meant. So there it is. You spent an entire day in a kingdom where getting dressed was an act of quiet courage. You woke forbidden the colour purple, denied the shimmer of gold, priced out of silk by the number attached to your name. You were told which furs your rank could touch and which would land you in front of a magistrate. You wore a mandatory cap to church, propped a starched collar the size of a wagon wheel beneath a wary official's gaze, and walked streets where a stranger could demand proof of your income just to explain your shirt. From the wool on your head to the honest plain stockings on your legs, every inch of you was ranked, watched, and kept firmly in its place. And yet, through all of it, people lived. They dressed each morning under laws designed to remind them exactly how small they were, and they got up and did it anyway. They saved for the coat they might never legally wear, found small joys in the colours they were allowed, and slowly, stubbornly, kept blurring the lines until the whole anxious system simply gave way. They proved, without meaning to, that a person is so much more than the fabric assigned to them. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, free to wear whatever you like tomorrow, any colour, any cloth, no permission required, no inspector at the gate, maybe spare a soft thought for the people who lived under the watchful eye of the wardrobe police, and who endured it with grace. History was petty and strange and often deeply unfair, but it was also, in the end, survivable, and so are you. Now let your shoulders drop, let the day go, and drift off gently. Sleep well.